My name is Mary Ann Johnson, and I'm the current president of the Chicago Women's History Center. And when thinking about my welcoming remarks, I thought, you know, the best thing that I could do would be to thank all the people that have helped us along the way. We've been an organization that got started 50 years ago. We're a volunteer organization, nonprofit. We've struggled along. Sometimes we've done remarkable projects. We've done incredible research. We've promoted good public programs and so on. But we didn't do it by ourselves. There was a tremendously important women's history community in Chicago. And I just want to call attention to them and thank them for being involved with us. So I want to start first of all by thanking Columbia College and the Columbia College Alumni Association for providing this fabulous space for us for this event tonight. As far as major donors to the event, I want to especially thank Ann Terry Strauss, who is an old friend of mine from elementary school in Hyde Park. But she came forward and provided us with a very generous donation, and we're really appreciative in honor of her mother, who was a great supporter of women's rights and women's history. I also want to thank Yvette Cordova and Mona Noriega, the Crossroads Fund, and Esther Nieves, and the many other smaller donors to the event. We received notices from lots and lots of people who said, I can't come, I'm going to be out of town, I can't afford the ticket, but I want to donate. And so we received wonderful donations from a large group of people. We've gone through a major transformation in the field of women's history during the last 50 years, and I think we should think back on it tonight. I remember when we were just starting to talk about the organization in the early 70s, there were a few, very few, intrepid women history scholars scattered throughout Chicago colleges and universities. And they were working on their own. They were isolated. They believed in women's history, but they weren't in connection with each other, with an interest in women's history. And some of them went to their department heads, all men, and said, I think I'd like to teach a course on women's history. And they were told, women's history? Do you really think there's enough information to teach an entire course on women's history? And just look at where we are now. That's what 50 years of hard work has done. What a transformation we've gone through since that time. And CWHC has been blessed to be part of that transformation, but only a part. So at this point, I'd like to thank some of those that have been part of our journey during the past dramatic and exciting 50 years. First, I want to mention Jean Hunt, who was our mentor and our leader in the very early days. Jean was from a small town in Michigan and came to Chicago to attend the University of Chicago in the 1960s. She developed a passionate interest in women's history in the early days and organized us to begin the group whose birthday we celebrate today. There were several women enthusiasts that joined her at the time, and you will learn about this later today. But I want to mention one in particular who sometimes gets overlooked in our history. Jean was our president for many years, but in the 1980s, Mary Lynn Ritzenthaler took over the helm. Not for very long, but for a few years, and her contribution was significant. At the time, she was an archivist at UIC, and she set up an archive for the organization there, which continues today and contains all the papers that resulted from our gargantuan book, Women Building Chicago, as well as other relevant documents. And so she, as an archivist, understood the importance of archives in writing women's history. And she said, this organization needs to have an archive, and it will be here at UIC, where the Jane Addams Hull House Museum is and the Jane Addams Memorial Collection was. After that, Jean took over as president again. I also want to make special mention of all the various board members of CWHC through the years, some of which are with us here today and others are watching on Zoom. Unfortunately, many of them have passed away because it was 50 years ago that we began. To mention just a few that are still with us, Phyllis Tholen, who was our secretary for many years, very important contributor to our organization because she sold women's history books, rare books. She collected them. She and her husband were both rare book collectors and sellers, but her specialty was women's history. And she went around all over the United States to old barns and looked at stuffy old collections, finding gems, and brought them back so that we could purchase them and add them to our libraries. Phyllis Tholen, and Sharon Alter, others, Sharon Alter, Leah Axelrod, Margaret Banerjee, Linda Evans, Erin McCarthy, who is here today, Beth Myers, who was the archivist at Mundelein at Loyal Women's History Archives there, and then eventually went on to be an archivist at Smith College, so she has done very well for herself. Carmen Prieto, Joan Schlichter, and Christine Gomez, to name just a few. There were many others. There were many young people who joined us for a year or two, contributed greatly, and then went on to other things. But most of all, I want to call out the amazing group of women who made up the editorial board of Women Building Chicago. And this is the book, our tome. It's hard to lift, 6 pounds. Women Building Chicago contains the biographies of 423 women from Chicago history. So it was a major, major book. So I want to call out the group who stepped forward, stepped out of their lives, essentially, to work on this book for over a long period of years. The editorial board of Women Building Chicago, headed by our 2 project directors and co-editors, Rima Lunan-Schultz, who is not here today but is watching by Zoom from Oak Park, and Adele Hast. Adele Hast passed away a couple of years ago, but Rima, who couldn't be with us, is watching at home. Hello, Rima. A shout out to you. This editorial board, we had a board. I was on the board. I considered myself very lucky because these were some really good historical women historians and so on. And we met once a week for over a year, if you can believe it, in order to make plans for the book, review and select entries, find and train writers, and edit the biographies. We ended up with 423 extensive biographies of women from Chicago history, so this was quite a task because we left a lot on the cutting room floor. We had a criteria in order to be in the book. Women had to have some influence on the history of Chicago, not just born here and then left, but had some major historical influence. And then there also needed to be enough information at that time when we were working on it to write a full-length biography, some of them 7,000 words. So we ran across many names, many women who came up, and we just didn't have the information at that time to do it, but we have a database and we can continue on from there. Those involved in the effort, in addition to Rima and Adele, included Carolyn DeSwart Gifford, who was an American historian and a scholar, lived in Evanston until recently when she moved to Reno. But she was a specialist in Frances Willard, and she had translated, copied all of Frances Willard's journals, which she found, which was a major, major accomplishment because they were all written in her handwriting, and that wasn't easy. It wasn't. So that was a major thing, and then she's written several other books that include the work of Frances Willard, the great temperance leader from Evanston. Babette Engelhardt, who taught at Chicago State and was a specialist in women's literature. Cheryl Johnson Odom, who was at Loyola and teaching in the history department there. Clara Stetter, myself, I was on the board as a representative because at that time I was working at the Jane Addams Hull House Museum, and later Peg Strobel, who was our liaison with UIC when we got a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. But I particularly want to call out the name of Rima Schultz, who was not only the president of CWHC at the time, but was also the intellectual force behind this book, and whose vision and tenacity made it the very remarkable tome that it is today. It is the primary resource for the history of Chicago women during this early period, 1790 to 1990, and probably the primary resource for any urban city in terms of women's history during this period. And I don't want to forget a deep thank you to the 350 writers who wrote biographies for this book. We didn't write all these biographies. We enlisted a huge group of people. Some of these writers were already working on books. They were working on Ida B. Wells, or they were working on some notable women. Others, we just simply assigned them a topic and they went to work. But they were all very dedicated. We had guidelines. They followed our guidelines. They created the right footnotes. And each of the entries in the end had a small paragraph, a source paragraph, so that if you wanted to do further research, it's in the book. You can look it up. You can find out where they got their information, what archive they used, what oral histories they did, etc. So it has led to much, much further research. Many of these writers have gone on to be notable writers of other works and expanded their entries into full-length books. You're all an important member of the CWHC family, and we will never forget you. I also want to thank the many people who have helped us along the way by attending our public programs, participating in our research, or donating to our collections. Thanks also to the many organizations that we collaborated with on programs like the Working Women's History Project, the Newberry Library, UIC, the Chicago History Museum, the League of Women Voters, the AAUW, and many other groups through the years. And finally, I want to make mention of the tremendously rich archival community that exists in Chicago. We are indeed blessed to have so many fine institutions that have supported our work, encouraged us, worked with us, and that we have contributed to, including UIC's Jane Addams Memorial Collection and their early Midwest Women's Collection, to Loyola's Women in Leadership Collection, to the fine collection of ephemera at Northwestern, which was started in the 1970s by a woman that I remember very well, Sarah. And it was her idea, and she sold it to Northwestern to begin collecting ephemera from the 70s. And she put herself on the mailing list of newspapers and periodicals and articles of all over the United States, and gathered them in. So there's a fantastic collection up there at Northwestern. To the Harsh Research Collection at Woodson Library, to the amazing Chicago History Museum, and to the many other smaller repositories throughout the city. We are rich indeed in material for the study of women in the history of Chicago. And I just want to emphasize that we have been a center for women's history for 50 years. We've been kind of the node, and we have reached out to lots and lots of communities. But the archival community in Chicago is an amazing one, and it must be taken seriously, it must be supported, because it's a rich resource. Lastly, I want to thank all of you who've helped create a vital women's history community in Chicago. From statues, to public memorials, to murals, to performance art, to photography exhibits, your efforts have made imaginative uses of Chicago Women's History Center resources and materials, expanding our reach into many areas. And so you all have been a part of our long 50 years of transforming, literally transforming the field of women's history in the city and the nation. And we are grateful to you for doing so. So give yourself a hand. Your interest and support. I'm giving you a hand, and all of those people out there. Your interest and support has been essential to our success, and we consider you an important part of our family as we move forward to the next 50 years of honoring, celebrating, and recording women's history. Thank you. Okay, so we're very honored. Chicago Women's History Center is very honored to have 3 notable honorary hosts. They've agreed to be our honorary hosts, and they've helped us in many ways by helping us to publicize our event and promoting it through their various networks. So I want to introduce them. There are 3 of them. The first one is Michelle Duster, who I'm sure you all know. The second one is Tracy Baim, who others of you know. And the third one is Heather Booth. So I'd like to introduce each of you. Michelle, could you come up and say hello to our audience and maybe say a few words? Now, I know you know Michelle Duster. Michelle Duster has been a tremendous figure in the field of women's history. She has taught, she has written, she has educated, and she has advocated strongly for public memorials to women's history throughout the city, and was responsible for creating really the one who was behind the creation of the fabulous Ida B. Wells monument that is now standing on the south side. There was a sculpture that was done by Richard Hunt. I first met Michelle years ago when she was very young, and I was very young, and we were both young then. And she was one of the writers, and she wrote about her grandmother, was that right? Alfreda Duster, and who was the daughter of Ida B. Wells, is that right? I have to be sure that I get this lineage right. And the mother of Maxine Duster, who is Michelle's mother. And unfortunately, Maxine Duster passed away yesterday, so I just want to have all of us offer our condolences to Michelle on this very sad occasion. She wrote to me, and I just assumed she wouldn't be here because of this time that she needs to spend with her family. But this afternoon she walked in, and here she is. So Michelle, we honor you. We honor your work. We honor your dedication, and we know that you want to be known not just as the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, but known for your 30 years of work on behalf of women's history and advocating for the history of many stories that are overlooked or misconstrued. So, Michelle, would you like to say a few words? You have some words? Oh, good, okay. That's what we want.
Thank you. I actually had some prepared remarks. So, and I'm here, even though my mother passed away. I'm related to Ida B. Wells through my father. So my mother is granddaughter-in-law of Ida B. Wells. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the remarks. Thank you for coming. Some of you who I did email are here. Hi everybody. Thanks for being here. My brother is here. Here as well. I told him he'd be in the double minority, and he was okay with that. So I just wanted to say that the Women's History Center has focused on documenting, preserving, and promoting the contributions Chicago women made to the city, state, country, and world for 5 decades. This rich history has too often been left out of, as we all know, that's why we're here, right? This rich history has too often been left out of school curriculum and thereby our country's narrative. And we know women make up 51% of the population, but only 3% of information in history textbooks includes women. 3%! And less than 7% of public statuary depicts women. So we have a really, really long way to go in order to create equity. Women have had to fight for 70 to 100 years in order to gain the right to vote. And I say between 70 to 100 because every single woman in this country did not get the right to vote in 1920. It took another few decades for some other women to get the right. And we've only had autonomy over our bodies for about 50 years, right? And so today, due to several setbacks, we are fighting some of the same fights as our parents and as our grandparents and even beyond some of our grandparents. But we can be inspired by those who came before us. We have to be, right? We can't give up. And those people are documented by, guess who? The Chicago Women's History Center. Yay! So I first became involved about 30 years ago, when I was about 10 years old. When I was approached to write a segment for this tome, as you've all seen, about my grandmother, Alfreda Duster. And to me, it was such an honor to not only have the opportunity to contribute to this amazing work, but to also write about my grandmother, who was a lot of times overshadowed by her mother, Ida B. Wells. So my grandmother, Alfreda Duster, was a social worker, and her work was important. The fact that Women Building Chicago included women like my grandmother, who worked on more of a local level and a community level, was important, as so many women who are included in this book are. Not everybody is a national and international superstar historic figure, but women who worked on the grassroots level need to be recognized as well. So I was a board member of Chicago Women's History Center for a decade, and I served as an officer with the incredible Mary Ann Johnson as president and all the other leaders for 6 of those years. So during that time, the organization transitioned from a small group to me of dedicated women to becoming an official center for gathering, researching, and studying. Also launched was the important oral history project documenting women's activism and leadership in Chicago area 1945 to 2000 to chronicle the experiences of those activists who continued the fight for equity. So over the past decade, I have been involved in several projects to honor my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, some of her contemporaries, as well as some more current leaders. So CWHC was extremely supportive of the Ida B. Wells National Monument, National Monument, which was installed in Bronzeville last summer, and the large-scale suffrage mural that was installed on 33 East Ida B. Wells Drive. It's near Wabash, near Harrison. Right down the street. You all can just go see that some other time after we leave here. And information about all 10 of the women featured on the 7-story mural on the Wings of Change by Jasmina Kazuko is included in, guess what? Women Building Chicago resource. So I want everybody to, we need to say their names. These women need to be known. So repeat after me. Mary Livermore.
Mary Livermore.
Myra Bradwell.
Myra Bradwell.
Frances Willard.
Frances Willard.
Fannie Barrier Williams.
Fannie Barrier Williams.
Jane Addams.
Jane Addams.
Catherine Wall McCulloch.
Catherine Wall McCollum.
Ida B. Wells.
Ida B. Wells.
Grace Wilbur Trout.
Grace Wilbur Trout.
Mary Fitzbutler Waring.
Mary Fitzbutler Waring.
And Agnes Nestor.
Agnes Nestor.
Those are the women on the mural that the Chicago Women's History Center helped to make happen. So we are doing things in this city together to make sure that we are not invisible anymore. So despite the triumphs of getting these projects done, we all know there are barriers and resistance. Shocking, right? In fact, the sister mural to Speak Up by Dorian Sylvain has been blocked for an entire year. It was supposed to be kitty corner to the mural that has been installed. Because it was considered too political. The words, "I'm speaking," were considered too political to be installed. Okay, go figure, right? So for over a year, we have been fighting to have our voices heard, to have us speak. This obstacle is really small compared to what our foremothers overcame, yet it is greatly disappointing that in 2022, somebody finds the words "I'm speaking" by a woman to be too political to actually be seen. So, but yet, with organizations like the Chicago Women's History Center, we will forge ahead, we will resist, we will document, and we will celebrate ourselves. It is no small thing that Chicago Women's History Center has been around for 50 years. 50 years. And with so much work to be done, we will be around for another 50 years, and that will whiz by very quickly. So thank you all for your hard work and dedication. You all are truly appreciated, and we salute every single person in this room who has contributed to making sure that women's history is seen, taught, and celebrated. So here's to the Women's History Center, here's to another 50 years, and here's to all of us making sure that our stories are told. Thank you.
Okay, our second honorary host is Tracy Baim. Everybody knows Tracy, right? Come on up, Tracy, and say a few words. Tracy has been a leader in journalism in Chicago for many decades, ever since she was a baby, right? Yeah, got started when she was awfully young. And she started Windy City Times, and she's recently been the editor of The Reader. And this is just the beginning. She's written many, many important books that would never have been written if it weren't for Tracy's dedication. And she's been involved in producing plays and movies, and she's just a powerhouse of productivity. So I want to introduce to you Tracy Baim, and thank you, Tracy, for being one of our honorary hosts.
Thank you. It's certainly an honor to be here. I started my work in Chicago gay journalism in 1984 when I was 21 years old, and I knew immediately how important it was to be a pack rat. The information that we were writing about, the press releases, the flyers, everything I was doing, Mona Noriega and I taking photos, everything we were doing, nobody else was covering. So everything about those ACT UP protests, not the big splashy ones downtown, but every single protest about HIV/AIDS, every Mount Moving Coffee House events, everything that was happening, somehow in my mind I just knew how important it was going to be to document and save those documents. Over 250 boxes of my archives and Windy City Times archives are at the Chicago Public Library now, safely stored out of my basement. And I've digitized most of them, so I have over 1 million documents that are digitized, and I have a copy on a, but you can applaud, but they're not organized. So Chicago Public Library has them all on a hard drive and 250 actual boxes of negatives and photos, a lot of the Monas, and I have them as well. So my project as I turn 60 this coming January is to try to start chipping away different projects out of those documents to get them more available for the public. As we're losing ground on women's rights, on civil rights, on actual facts, and textbooks in schools, as we're losing ground on that, we have to take advantage of the tools where we can distribute that information outside of the schools to people that want them. I have a website called chicagogayhistory.org where in 2007 I did about 200 video oral histories of folks. I get emails from 8th graders and other folks around the city that want to know and meet these people. People like Linda Buban back there from Women and Children First Bookstore. They want to see these stories, and they get a chance, they could actually get these people to come to their classes and talk to them. About 20% of those people have passed away since I interviewed them. And it just, every day we lose a whole library of a person when they pass away, like Michelle's mother. And so we have to get those stories down as much as possible. And it's been an honor to kind of come into the movement. When I was 21, it was 15 years past Stonewall riots in 1969. I had a chance to meet that pre-Stonewall generation. People like Renee Hanover, who had done pioneering work in the 50s and 60s. And so I just feel like I was plopped at the perfect moment in history to have experienced and learned from the women before me, and to help educate and share information with the people, the women that come after me. And for the LGBTQ community in particular, it's been so ignored and vilified and terribly covered over the years. Those documents are breadcrumbs to the truth. So thank you to the work you're doing. I have my tome at home as well. This was a really groundbreaking book. Still today, decades later, it's still very important. So support the historians, support the history projects, and so that way beyond, and 50 years from now, that those folks will have those breadcrumbs to our stories. Thanks.
Okay, our third host is Heather Booth, who lives in Washington, and she really wanted to come today. She wanted to be with us, but she can't travel. She's had foot surgery recently.
Congratulations, Chicago Women's History Center. You play such an important role in preserving, promoting, and helping to encourage the future generation to make history, just as we did in those early days in Chicago. I remember from rape crisis, cultural change, Women's Liberation School, NOW, YWCA, so many other efforts, abortion counseling, and so much more. And now those struggles continue. And the Chicago Women's History Center is a key part of advancing that history, especially when it's often been ignored or not given its due by some of the more prominent events that happened on the East or West Coast. But in Chicago, we always made things happen. And Mary Ann Johnson, thank you for your leadership. All of you who are at this celebration, I wish I could be there with you. This is Heather Booth. I am a sister in the struggle from then and from now, but I'm another event right now, so I can't be with you tonight. All the best. And the struggle continues. In sisterhood and for our growing power, till all of us have an equal voice.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce another spectacular board member, Maureen Hellwig, who's been on our board for a long time and is now the vice president, was the treasurer for many years, now the vice president. So Maureen, come on up. She is going to be introducing our speaker.
Good evening and welcome again. My assignment, a pleasurable one to be sure, is to introduce our guest speaker, Esther Nieves. But before I do that, I want to take one moment to acknowledge the woman who has led us through so many of these 50 years. Please join me in thanking Mary Ann Johnson. Now, let me introduce another woman that I respect and admire and consider a friend, Esther Nieves. I have known Esther since she served on the board of my employer, at that time Erie Neighborhood House in the 1990s, and then was happy to call her boss when she became the executive director there from 1997 to 2003. Esther has also distinguished herself in the world of philanthropy at the Field Foundation and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Sadly, we never received those free cornflakes we were hoping for. She distinguished herself also in local government as director of the Mayor's Commission on Latino Affairs under Harold Washington. In her own tongue-in-cheek sense of humor, she has titled her talk, Hellraisers and Hairnets, Resolute Change Makers, 50 Years and Beyond. So please join me in welcoming our very own Hellraiser, Esther Nieves.
Good evening. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
I hear that. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this. And I like that title. It came to me as I was reflecting on the women I was reading about in this book, which is a great book. I really actually want to start by thanking the members of the Chicago Women's History Center, some of the women that are here and some of the women that we saw in the video. It is humbling to be part of such an event, particularly with the kind of world that we're facing these days. I especially want to thank Mary Ann as the president and founder, and I want to appreciate and thank my colleague and friend Maureen. These are the first two Hellraisers I want to acknowledge tonight. And after looking at the board of directors, I must say that's a cadre of Hellraisers, and that's a good thing, don't you think? I also want to acknowledge some of my family members who drove in from Indiana and Chicago. Why don't you all stand? Stretch, stand, come on. Stand, my husband and my mother-in-law. My mother-in-law who's 80-something. I want to thank them. And my sister Yvette, my nieces and nephews, the next generation of Hellraisers. I want to share that after having been married for, 25 plus years, thank you. Sometimes I think he's on medicated when he listens to me talk about Donald Trump. But to say that after 25 plus years of being married, my mother-in-law taught me how to make Mexican tortillas. And that's really special because Puerto Ricans don't necessarily eat tortillas, and it's a whole kind of special way to do it. And I think her recipe is about 150 years old. So can you imagine all the women that have become before me to do that? So thank you, Doña Anita. That's very nice of you. That's a Hellraiser, but she's a quiet one. She doesn't want me to say that. Let me just say that the story of Chicago's women continues to be written, and it's unfolding as we speak. Those who came before us, and even today, have been or are described as, and I know some of you in this room are familiar with this, troublemakers, outliers, provocateurs, radical, militant, social justice warriors, spirited, how about that one, huh? Spitfire, and of course, Hellraisers. And there's other words that come to mind, but I don't want to share that in polite company. And to those people that call us these names, and other names, I wanna say with intentional appreciation, thank you, right? In the spirit of the Mexican and the Latin American tradition of the Day of the Dead, how many of you are familiar with that beautiful? Yeah, that's great. And I'm sure you have probably maybe your grandmothers and aunties and sisters, you've probably seen the movie Coco. You remember the strong, somebody's shouting yes. The strong women in that video, in that movie, and it speaks to death as something to celebrate. So I want to invite the spirit of some of the women that you've already heard about today, but that I want to pause and reflect on. This is a celebratory circle, and I want to remember them tonight. Many of us are familiar with Jane Addams and her work in Chicago, Settlement House. We saw her photograph. We know there's a school named after her and all these great things that are part of her memory, of her history and the memory that we have of her. And she definitely was considered a hellraiser, right? But do you know that another hellraiser was Ellen Gates Starr? How many of you are familiar with Ellen Gates Starr? Ah, great. She was born in 1859 and she died in 1940. But between those years, Ellen lived her life as a social reformer, one of the founders of Hull House, a labor activist, and definitely a hellraiser. Her core values were rooted in her sense of integrity, spirituality, and her incessant quest, as she wrote, and I quote, to stand with the humble and meek, unquote. She also became a member of the Socialist Party, was routinely arrested for joining picket lines, and in 1916, calm down, she ran for alderperson of the 19th Ward under the Socialist Party banner in Chicago. And, can you imagine running for Chicago City Council during those years, way back? Sometimes I wonder about running for the City Council now, right? But as she expected, she lost. But she used that opportunity to lift up several issues, primarily the exploitation of poor and low-wage workers, and particularly women in restaurants and factories. I'll get back to Ellen in a little while. You also may have seen, and you've already heard about the great Ida B. Wells Barnett, but you saw that our Chicago Congress Parkway, for those of us that have lived here all our lives, has been renamed Ida B. Wells. But I wanted to pause and think about, why do we honor her? Why is it that I'm always driving on the Ida B. Wells, and I know that there were public housing that were named Ida B. Wells, so I went to the book. It's a great book. And I did a little more reading, although I was very familiar with her story, but I wanted to delve a little bit more into Ida B. Wells Barnett. She was a teacher, a journalist, a suffragist, and a civil rights activist. She was the co-founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. And she was also the first person in the nation that launched the anti-lynching campaign, a national anti-lynching campaign. At one point in her teaching career, she lost her job because she called out the school system for its inadequate facilities for African-American Black children, and also the exploitation of teachers, Black female teachers, by white board members of the school. Ida B. Wells was also an investigative reporter. Way before Bob Woodward, way before Carl Bernstein, way before Donald Bartlett, way before Christine Amanpour, and many more. She started her writing journey in Memphis. She wrote about the growing number of lynchings in the South, namely that it was due to economic competition and racial control. And she challenged the narrative that Black men were being killed because they were raping white women. She wrote an editorial that resulted in the destruction of her newspaper's office and threats that she would be lynched. She had to hightail it out of there. Her friends told her, you need to leave. But she still worked and did her writing, but she did it elsewhere. She did it in our great city. She also, one little tidbit that I found is she also helped establish the first Black kindergarten in Chicago. She supported the families of Black men who were lynched. She mobilized communities, she mobilized congregations, she mobilized leaders, even leaders in her community that didn't want to speak out against the lynchings. So for example, in 1909, when a mob killed Froggy James in Cairo, Illinois, she went down there and organized the community to stand up against the people that had lynched him. She was praised as the race's greatest advocate, but another person lamented that a woman was, and I quote, doing the work naturally presumed to be that of the men. Yeah, I don't think that goes over well, and I didn't like that. But she was described by the Chicago Defender as that watchdog of human life and liberty. So much more can be said about Ida B. Wells, and I was sharing with her granddaughter my piece before she had to leave, when she was appreciative, and I said, no, I'm appreciative of your mom and your grandmother and all the others that came before you and the work that they've done. But I asked that, actually, when you're driving down Ida B. Wells, you also roll down your window and say, thank you, Mrs. Wells. She deserves that. There she is writing, I looked at her stories, there she is writing about the East St. Louis massacre, where nearly 100 blacks were killed. There she is writing in Texas, in Houston, Texas, where she memorialized black soldiers who had been court-martialed and hung for firing on the city in response to white harassment. So I think Ida B. Wells was definitely a hellraiser. Up to her last day on this earth, she was a writer, an activist, and also a woman, a principled woman that gathered other women to advocate for justice. Her living room was her political arm for the NAACP and a bunch of other organizations that she was part of. It's no wonder that early in her life, her colleagues titled her the Princess of the Press. Truly a hellraiser. There are so many women to mention, and I hope you get the chance to read Women Building. I'm not making a commercial, but I really actually encourage you to read this book. It is a biographical, and it's filled with so much information of the women that we hear about and mention often in the history books, but that we don't know much about. There's another woman I want to mention tonight that I think was particularly important to the plight of communities of color in Chicago, particularly Latinos, immigrants, and other communities that have come to Chicago and identified this as their haven. Maria Cerda, a woman I had the privilege to meet, was a woman with a back of steel, and certainly the definition of what I'd say a hellraiser and tenacious trailblazing. In the 1960s, she was the first Latina member of the Chicago Board of Education. She was also a vocal advocate for bilingual classes. She was the founder of several nonprofits, including the Latino Institute. She also marched with Dr. King in Marquette Park in 1966. Not something she didn't talk about, but that her family mentions often about her. And she was also undoubtedly what I call a hellraiser. But Maria's life can't be remembered without mentioning her encounter with immigration officers. Let me explain. In 1985, while serving as a member of Mayor Washington's cabinet and head of the city's employment and workforce department, Maria was stopped by immigration officers, confronted, and asked to see her immigration papers, right, her permanent residency card or whatever they wanted. The officers were not aware who they were speaking to, and they were also not aware that Puerto Ricans, which she was, are citizens of the United States, but that's another conversation. Back then she said, and I quote, "If this can happen to me, imagine what is happening to other people that have less power and access than I do," unquote. So she subsequently met with Mayor Washington and shared her experience about the immigration officers and what they harassed her and talked to her and sort of bullied her, quite frankly. Not too long after that, Mayor Washington issued an executive order. Do you remember that executive order? Some of you are nodding. Yes, yes, yes. After that, he met with his cabinet and he issued a proclamation, and he stood and had a press conference and said that he was prohibiting city employees from enforcing federal immigration laws. He took this step after he heard Maria's story and to protest the federal government's decision to question people about their immigration status, or because immigration officers wanted to go through the city's records in an effort to, as they said, find undocumented workers. That executive order has been signed by subsequent mayors, and it is a true example of how Chicago, and a hellraiser in Chicago, made Chicago what it is today, a welcoming city, a sanctuary city, a city that right now has recently received over 2,000 people fleeing various forms of abuse and persecution. A hellraiser for sure, but a hellraiser for basic dignity. It is this resolute spirit and shared energy of the past 50 years that we must continue to build on. And we have to do this in a nation that has decided to limit our fundamental ability to control our bodies, and where fear of the other is now a constant, where elected and public officials as leaders have become the flag bearers for nationalism, misogyny, incessant xenophobia, and gun-toting rallies, even as the nation experiences daily deaths and the violence wrought by handguns. It is no wonder that the groups with names that I'll name in a minute, such as the Proud Boys, the Freemen, the Skinheads, the Oath Keepers, the Boogaloo Boys, the Wolverine Watchmen, and many others, are the faces and voices behind these messages. This is not to say that women are not part of these movements. Yes, there is the presence of women, but we, those of us in this room tonight, as we pause to celebrate 50 years, must also think about this nation's next 50 years and what we want it to look like and what we want it to be. If the power and force of the women that I have mentioned tonight is still with us, Ida and Maria and Ellen, and I believe that it is, then I think we have the responsibility to turn the tide on what is happening in the nation, in this state, and in our beloved city. I call on you to act by voting, and it's just around the corner, by bringing others to vote with you, by walking picket lines to support workers like Ellen, and by using the pen as your voice to give voices to injustice, like Ida B. Wells Barnett did. And to stand with immigrants and refugees in this darkest period of hate-filled rhetoric in this country. Many of us will not forget Maria Celda's action and her righteous indignation when it happened to her. She didn't stew in her anger. She acted. She did something about it. She spoke for those who did not have a voice. All these women did their part. And tonight, it's our turn to look down the road, to envision the city and nation we want, and to will ourselves, our energy, our spirit, our resources, our email list, our text messages, to make it so and to bring the next generation of Hellraisers into the fold. That's why I always appreciate when Demi, my niece, and my other niece, Gabriela, come to see me and talk, because I've told them repeatedly, I want to hang up my chancletas, and you're stepping into that light. Yeah? I'll finish where I started. In 1914, Ellen supported the striking Henrici restaurant waitresses who were picketing for improved working conditions. Again, she landed in jail. When she appeared in court, and knowing that Hull House's donors and supporters were upset with her routinely joining women picket lines and being arrested, she was always fighting for decent wages and better work conditions. I can only imagine her board saying, Ellen, let it go, let it go. But no, she didn't. Ellen used the opportunity when she appeared before the court to expose the experiences of the female workers. All of these workers were waitresses on the picket line, in jail, and in the restaurants, and the little pay that they were receiving for 8 hours of back-breaking work. If you look at photos of this period, you will notice that waitresses wore hairnets, and of course, a complete uniform. At her court hearing, Helen talked about various realities. That of being a woman of some means, but dedicating herself to the women with hairnets in restaurants and in factories. Implicit in this story is the class reality of our country. We live in a capitalist society. There's the have and the have-nots. In her case, women in hairnets were the have-nots. Once when asked why she was a socialist, she said, I am a socialist because I am a Christian. Speaking to the Hinsdale Women's Club, she said to the members, to apply the laws of Christ to the conditions of the time, saying something like, if we cannot, as Christians, admit that there's something wrong with our society and the age in which we're living, we must figure out how to remedy it. So I think she speaks to this present time in our history as well. I ask you to be a Hellraiser who stands with the many women in hairnets. Today, these are women of many hues. Unemployed women who lost their jobs during the pandemic, factory working women who are now caring for sick family members, immigrant woman who can no longer serve your food at the restaurant because the restaurant has closed. Surely you may know one or several of these women. If you had a wonderful salad or a delicious fruit over the past months, I suspect that a woman has been part of the production, the picking, or the cleaning process of that piece you're eating or the salad you're enjoying. Or I suspect that a woman in a hairnet likely cleaned your room and cleaned after you if you were staying at a hotel. Women in Chicago and other metropolitan areas comprise the bulk of the leisure and hospitality industry, education and health, and other such industries. And women of color, and in particular Latinas, are part of this industry of service. So you see, you can be hellraisers with sisters in hairnets, and with allies who envision a Chicago that stands on the shoulders of Ellen and of Ida and Maria, and of the work that the Chicago Women's History Center has been doing for the last 50 years. I want you to think about the future, and I want you to move forward into that future and into the destiny that we want to shape and the city that we want to see. I think it's possible, and I think it's possible because this room has the muscle, this room has the shared aspirations of unity, and this room is packed with love. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah. I think so. And so I want to thank you for listening to these stories, but I urge you to continue to listen to the women that do not have a voice. Those are some of the women that I've mentioned. Over the last 2 months, I've been working at a shelter of some of the women that are arriving in this city. Many do not speak English. Many are fleeing situations in their home countries that are horrific. And many of them have come into this country asking nothing but to be helped, to stand on their feet, to move forward, and to make it a better life for their children. I ask you to be part of that circle. Thank you, and thank you, Chicago Women's.
Thank you, Esther, for that inspiration. Okay, so this concludes the formal part of our program, and we're now going to have a reception